These principles that I'm going to teach you today have made me $10,000 on my own. They are pretty simple, I would say, and I want to teach them to you, not promising that you're going to make 10K overnight, but definitely that if you practice these principles in time in the specialized field that I will talk about here in just a second, and you stick it out enough repetition, you will have a valuable skill. And these principles are design principles, in particular as it relates to UI and UX design for web development, but also you can extend that out to specializations in doing landing pages, e-commerce stores, dashboards, mobile apps. You can do so much with these principles, and I want to teach them to you. My name is Fido. I am a software engineer that specializes in front-end web development, and through that journey, I became adept at being able to design. Now, I think that there are probably more than just the principles that I'll teach here in general in the world of design and UI, UX, but in particular UI. But I would say these are some of the most apparent and most widely used principles. So if you learn these, you will be able to use them throughout your career as a designer. And like I said, hopefully with enough practice, you will one day be able to use this skill and monetize it. If all that sounds interesting to you, I recommend that you watch the video, pay attention closely, maybe take some notes. And if you have any questions, just let me know at the end of the video. Happy learning. All right, so let's talk symmetry. A lot of UI and UX design really boils down to this core principle. So the first option we'll look at here, or the first example, is an example of symmetry. Here you have the frame of an iPhone 16 in terms of dimension, and you have this white rectangle outlined, and then you have this blue rectangle at the dead center of this white rectangle. And if you divide it into 4 quadrants divided by this red line, you'll note that each quadrant has equal proportions of the 2 available shapes, which are the white and blue rectangle. And there's something to that. There's something about that symmetry, if you will, the equal proportions of these shapes across these different quadrants that we find as humans visually pleasing, right? Now, this is one example of symmetry. And if you actually scale this out and say, instead of just 1 blue rectangle, you actually want to do 3, you can see how the principle persists, right? You might add 3 rectangles, but if the proportions of those rectangles are equally distributed across the 4 quadrants, the symmetry will persist, and that visually pleasing element to what you're seeing will still be there, right? And inversely, on the other side of this, there is asymmetry. So asymmetry is just the opposite, which is an unequal distribution of the shape across the 4 quadrants, if you will. As you can see here, the dark blue rectangle now is shifted further to the left-hand side of the crosshairs. And this also creates a visual response from us that says something is just a bit off here, right? It's not quite symmetrical. It's more so asymmetrical because the balance, if you will, the visual balance is off. And you might not know it, but in a way, your eyes are always, no matter where you look, are setting up these crosshairs. So you somehow are able to pick up when things are in visual balance. And in reality, this would be more in places like your home. And you can also pick up when things are out of balance. So what I'm saying is these little crosshairs, these red crosshairs, you can't see them through your actual eye in and of itself, but you are always kind of putting objects and your experiences through the lens of these crosshairs. You're always looking for visual balances and disbalances. And they're not really good and bad. It's more so a combination of these elements that ends up making designs what they are. And I'll show you that in just a second. In a similar manner, if you actually were to scale this out into 3 shapes, you can persist that asymmetry, right? And you see a lot of asymmetric examples in three-dimensional space when you see abstract, impressionist style paintings as well. Just more organic shape things, and literally things across any given environment that you're in will tend to have asymmetrical aspects to them. This tends to be more organic stuff like plants, humans, and humans have symmetrical aspects to them, but definitely some asymmetrical aspects as well. And if you go, for example, to the forest, you'll notice a lot of asymmetry. Instead, if you go to, let's say, like a corporate office, you'll notice a lot of symmetry. All right. And these mechanisms are already working in us almost subconsciously when we're looking at things, but we don't always acknowledge them at this level because it's just how we operate, right? We're always looking for balance or disbalance visually. But my guess is that after watching this video, you'll start to notice these things a lot more in reality. And just to kind of give you a more clarified example, if you take a look at this product page for an e-commerce store, you actually can see both of these principles at play. You notice more of a symmetrical, not asymmetry, but symmetrical outline here, where you have this rectangle and these squares here, and you see an equal distribution of each, right? So let's say you have in this, and I'll show you here. So for example, you have this larger shape, which is encompassing the image, and then these, 5 squares. And you see, I would just, don't look at the guy real quick, just imagine this as a whole entire shape. And you see actually in this quadrant, an equal distribution of the elements, right? So you see here, like the 5 squares here. There's 2 squares on each side, and then this middle square is actually divided into 2, right? Or if you look at, for example, the guy is actually a little asymmetrical, right? So he's actually shifted a little bit to the left. So he's a little out of balance, but it's actually the use of both of these elements that ends up being what gives the aesthetic to what you're looking at. And actually, if you were to just bring this line up and just look at this square right here, this top square, then you start to see more of that symmetry play with that asymmetry. So you do see almost the equal distribution of his body, just with a slight shift over to the left. But I think this ends up being visually acceptable, mainly because it's a human being, like we're not the imperfections and the way that we stand, and the way that we look, the way maybe we tilt our heads, stuff like that. Like that's expected because we are an organic mechanism, if you will, right? Or an organic object, if you will. But it's really how these two principles play with each other that ends up making, like I say, the aesthetic. So this is maybe more on the left-hand side, a more symmetrical example. And then over here, we have a more asymmetrical example, mainly because of the distribution of objects. Here you might have the squares, but these squares, if you cut them down the middle, they're essentially divided equally in terms of spacing. And you could argue too, if you break this down, if you know anything about CSS, that all these are just rectangles in and of themselves, and you could split them in half and all that. But if you look at the actual content itself, I'm talking about the letters, the data, these squares down here, you see an uneven distribution of the shape of the stuff, right? So for example, you see the text here be a little bit unequally distributed, where maybe you have text here that you could cut this line right here down the middle of this text, but then you see this information like the rating information, how much items have been sold, and I'll zoom in here just a little bit more to the left. You'll see the pricing information to the left. And this is what it's called in UI UX, or even in traditional editing, or visual editing, as left aligned insofar as text. And then if you look down here, you also see these squares. These are also left aligned, right? Even the shapes down here, or the sizings, are left aligned as well. But then you get down here to the bottom, and you start to see some of that symmetry be recovered, right? Because you have these buttons, and these buttons, if you were actually to just make this into one big rectangle, you'd notice that the buttons are at the bottom of that rectangle. But if you cut a line down the middle, in general, this line is a little skewed, but in general, there will be equal portions button on the left-hand side of that line and equal portions button on the right hand side of that line. Now let's look back at this. So now you see how both the symmetry and asymmetry actually end up working together to present the visual, what makes something aesthetic, right? Is that it blends these two principles together. And I recommend that wherever you go, to look at the shapes that are around you, whether that's in your room right now, when you're out at the coffee shop, when you're out you're walking at the park. Look at the different examples of shapes around you. And I would invite you to, when you see those shapes, put the quadrant up and see how the balance of those shapes are, right? Are they skewed more to the left? Are they skewed more to the right? Are they equally distributed across those quadrants, across those crosshairs? In a similar manner, go to an organic place, go see a tree, see how asymmetrical that is, see how it's very skewed to one side over the other. And it's, like I said, it's a blending of those two things that ends up making the aesthetic. And this principle, you will use it over and over and over and over and over in UI, UX design. And I would argue that it's by understanding symmetry that you actually end up being able to unlock, I would say, a vast majority of what it takes to be able to do UI UX. Okay, so now we're going to look at alignment, and I'm going to go ahead and actually do a little bonus here and also talk about spacing, because I think these two principles are very complementary to one another. So the key thing with alignment is that when you're designing, you're going to want to make sure that things are in line with each other. So let's say, for example, we have 4 card elements that are laid out in this horizontal line from left to right. Okay, well, you would say, well, okay, we have the 4 elements here, but something seems off. In part, you could actually look at the symmetry of this and note that if we had a line running down the middle of this, you'd see that the elements are actually unequally distributed from the top to bottom half of each of these vertical rectangles, right? But there's also another element or another principle that you can analyze, which is the alignment of these visual objects, if you will. And if you were to draw a line from left to right, and this is essentially just an arbitrary line. This could be a section or just a visual line that you draw in your head. You'll note that these are actually out of line, right? And because of that, that creates almost a messy look to the visual, right? So it's as simple as saying, okay, well, if they're out of line, then you have to get them in line. And when you make the visual look correct, the line that you end up drawing is up to you. It's arbitrary, right? So it doesn't really matter essentially where the line is, as long as you're okay with that line being there. So let's just say I drew the line here, okay? Now, once I've drawn that line with my eye that everything has to line up at the border of this line, then I just have everything meet that boundary, right? So I just do something super simple on Figma, which is this auto layout feature. So I just hit that, and that instantly lines everything up, right? So now you see everything meets the boundary of this line. And pretty much a way that you can identify that you've met that boundary, at least from a visual perspective, is just where is that line that you drew in your mind's eye, and do any of the shapes cross it? If they don't and they're flush to that boundary, then you have actually been able to achieve alignment. Now, there's actually one more principle here that's wrong that we'll go over in just a bit. I did just want to show you one more example, because you don't just run into objects that are laid out horizontally, you also run into objects that are laid out vertically. Okay, so in this situation, let's say we drew this red line in our mind's eye, and this is at the first quarter of this shape if you're reading from left to right. And let's say we've now said, okay, well, this is the boundary that I decided to set, and everything else has to meet that, okay? All you have to do now is just bring these down to meet that boundary. And now whenever you read from up to down, you'll note that every single one of those objects actually meets that boundary, right? So when you're reading, you don't want to necessarily create these visual interruptions, or when you're looking at something visually, you don't want to create these visual interruptions, because your eyes almost scan in this up to down. I mean, they scan almost like in a straight line, if you could imagine it. So when you look down, you're gonna want to create this visual consistency at that boundary, right? And if you say here, okay, well, there's nothing here on this left-hand side of the boundary, and boom, all of a sudden you see this, and you see this one's outside of the boundary, this one's within the boundary. The inconsistency consistency kind of gives you almost like this sense of messiness, right? So it's really important to be consistently drawing lines everywhere with your eyes and looking at how different objects line up with each other, because it might be that these two objects actually, let's say, like, for example, we don't have this one and we don't have this one, right? It might be that these two objects occupy a different part of the UI, for example. But if they're not aligned, something will look really wrong. So you want to make sure that you're always making, wherever those lines are drawn, that you make sure that the objects that you draw respect the lines, right? So in this case, we'll bring this guy in a bit, and then we'll just reverse it so you can see the other objects. Okay, so now that we did that, we're going to take a look at spacing. Now, spacing, if you could tell here, these objects look decent enough, but there's actually an inconsistency in spacing. And the way to identify spacing is to look at the negative space. So don't look at the objects themselves, but look at the space that is between the objects. And if you look at that negative space, it's these white bars here, you'll actually note that the spacing between each of these rectangles is actually off. This one is thick, maybe a little bit thicker. This one's a lot thicker, and this one's very thin, right? So what you also pick up as a human is that those inconsistencies are there. From a designing perspective, you want to iron out those inconsistencies. So you want to make sure that the spacing is balanced and even across the different objects that are related to each other. So for example, these four objects are related to each other. In that case, it's very important that the spacing remain consistent across them. So Figma makes that really easy to do, where I just highlight that and then I just hit these bars right there, and boom, all of a sudden I have consistent spacing throughout each of those objects. So the key thing with paying attention to spacing is looking at the negative space. Once you've identified that the negative space is off between the related objects, then you have to implement, or then it's more than not a good idea to implement even spacing between those objects. So now let's look at this right here. Okay, so you see here, this one's, first of all, it's out of line. So we're gonna go ahead and actually put it in line. So I'm just gonna do that manually. Move this into the space. Boom. Okay, now everything here on the left-hand side is in line. But if you notice, again, pay attention to the negative spaces. And you could kind of almost imagine these like little white rectangles, or little, grayish white rectangles. Note that this is a lot thinner, a little bit thicker. This is kind of like in between, right? So the spacing is uneven between these objects, and they're related. So we want to make sure that we get proper spacing between them. So again, I'm just going to highlight that, and then boom. All of a sudden now I have even spacing. Okay, so now we are going to look at alignment and spacing in the real world, or at least in these designs. So for example, let's look at alignment here. If you note here, there's actually several lines going on. So if I actually go here from left to right, you'll know that there is a line that is running from left to right. And these objects here, let me make this a little bit bigger. So if you notice there, these objects are actually at the top meeting this visual alignment, or they're respecting this red boundary, right? They're not crossing that red boundary. You could actually say the same for these objects down here, right? They're respecting that boundary. And the boundaries don't just run from left to right, just like in our example. They also align up and down. So if you see this, they're respecting this boundary here on the left-hand side, right? So you see that alignment at play. You also see alignment with text elements. So for example, this element here, the top of this element actually is pretty close to matching the alignment of this text element here on the right-hand side. So you see this almost like subheadline match with the subtext there. If you see there's actually, you could find alignment there. Let me see if I could find more visual examples. You can actually see between the two pieces of text here that there is also alignment. So if you see these subheadlines, and we bring our red line down here, you see alignment on the left-hand side, right? So these rectangles are aligned, as you can see there, but so is this text. And this is between two different objects. But what ends up occurring is that when you have alignment across different but related objects, you create a sense of familiarity between those objects, and the mind identifies that this is coherent, like this stuff is supposed to go together, okay? And for example, there's some stuff back here. You'll see alignment between related text elements. So these pricing elements, you'll see alignment between them, right? It's not one is down here and then the other one's up here. They're both aligned, okay? And this is across different elements. So this is why it's so important to kind of zoom out and look at how everything's aligned, because it might be that this is, for you, this one card that you designed looks really aligned, but if this number's off, the coherence of the design in general might actually be off. So this is actually an example of something that's out of line a little bit. That's always difficult if you've ever done design. It's always difficult to deal with different amount of text, but this is actually slightly out of line. If you can see, there is a boundary there, right? And I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. There's a boundary there here, and you see this this text slightly go over that boundary, or I should say underneath that boundary. Okay, so the alignment is actually the visual alignment is actually more tilted like this. Okay, and that slight tilt it sounds kind of easy to miss, and perhaps it is for something so slight. But the more aggressive your stuff is out of alignment, the more it will be easy to notice. And you could even argue maybe the designer down here also messed up a little bit. No, I would say that's pretty good. That's pretty good. And see the vertical alignment here. So there's text here, and then there's text up here. It doesn't seem like he cared too much about these two being related to each other. So yeah, so the alignment in particular comes really in handy when when the two pieces of things that the two objects that you're trying to align have some sort of direct relationship to each other. Another one, like a typical one that you'll always see is menus. So menus, it's like you have like these like unrelated things. It's these seemingly unrelated things, but they're all within this like one bar, which is your navigation menu. And typically all of these should be in line. And maybe the line isn't just like at the edge, but if you look back at your symmetry principles, sometimes the alignment is also with like at the middle of the content. So if you actually maybe they're not aligned here, but if you actually move this towards the middle, you see, especially with your understanding of symmetry now, that everything's kind of split down the middle. So it looks like he didn't align them by the edge, but he aligned them almost through this central line here. So very, very interesting. So alignment also, it doesn't just have to be meet that edge boundary. So it doesn't always just have to be at the bottom or the top of something. It could also be right in the middle. And technically that is that's good. That's aligned. So very, very interesting. All right, now let's look at spacing. If you notice, this is actually a grid style. Just take a look at the negative space. So the space between here and here is pretty much even throughout, right? So right there, that spacing is even. The spacing is even right here too as well. So when you're looking at these things, we're really, to identify good spacing, you just want to look at the negative space. And if there's enough negative if the negative space is consistent across the different visual elements, then you have good spacing. So here, for example, you have these cards. So this is like the big visual element. So if you see here, you have good spacing here, then you have good spacing here. Okay, so that spacing is consistent. Let's look at these cards here, these cards as well. So let me actually go back to red. So you have good spacing here, and that's only because these negative spaces match. If these negative spaces don't match, then you have bad spacing. But if they do match, then you have good spacing. The key thing though with the spacing of the elements is that they have to be related. That's why it matters that things are space consistency when they're related. Like these three cards are related, right? They're really just three different versions of the same card, and because they're grouped together, the mind, the visual, the eye wants to see consistency across them, right? That you could say that can create trust in the user. I'm not going to go as far to say that's my intuition. But if things are related to each other, if these objects are related to each other, then it's extremely important that they have consistent spacing throughout, unless you can justify in your design why they shouldn't have consistent spacing. And that's the thing with all these principles, is that they're guiding posts, but they're not straight jackets, if you will. But let's see if I can find another element for spacing. You could argue here. So the negative space between the text and this object is consistent between the two pieces of text. So you have both the alignment. So you have the alignment of the line here, right? And then you also have the spacing consistency here, right? Between the imaginary line and these cards. Okay. So yeah. So spacing is very, very important. And the way to target the spacing is look at the negative spaces between a grouped set of items or related items. And if the negative space is inconsistent, you have a spacing problem, and that's what you got to fix. So in this next principle, what we are going to learn about is contrast. Now, contrast can be explained in, I think, many different ways, but the key thing is just to always, when you're going to overlay two visual elements, say for example, text and a background, you want to overlay either a light shade over a dark shade or a dark shade over a light shade instead of doing dark with dark and light with light. And I'll explain why that is the case here through these examples. But the key thing to know of why it's important to do contrast is mostly just so that it's easy for the reader, the viewer, the user to be able to grasp the content. And the way that you visually grasp a piece of content is by making it easily identifiable. So you see this first example everywhere on the internet, which is just a white to black contrast. And I would say this and then the rectangle here to the right hand side is pretty much the principle encapsulated in just this visual. So you notice that the Poppins, the font name, is easy to read because the background is white, right? And I realize this seems kind of almost intuitive if explaining it, and ideally it should be, right? But replicating it is where we really value the principle, because it's one thing to perceive it just naturally, right? But it's another to understand that it is a phenomena that occurs, and once you have that understanding, then you can manipulate the principle to do visual design. So here you have high contrast, and here also you have high contrast. Although the background is now black and not white, the contrast occurs because the Poppins font is white. So you see that principle at play, which is either dark background and light visual element at the front, or light background and dark visual element at the front. So it's not just beholden to these black and white schemes, or shades as I should say, but contrast also exists with colors. So for example, you see the yellow and the blue backdrop. This right here is technically high contrast. It's very easy to see the Poppins because those two colors, not only are they complementary, but they balance each other out in the sense that you're able to easily read the text. This is also high contrast here, the red backdrop with the white text. And then now some examples of low contrast. So right here, if we go here, this is low contrast, and pretty much it's because both visual elements have a dark colorway. So you have the traditional blue, which is a darker color on top of the traditional green, which is another darker color. So these two colors actually have very low contrast. If you were to combine them, maybe put this blue with this white, or this white with this green, then you would create contrast. But because both elements are dark, you actually don't have you have some contrast because they do have different shades of light within them, but not substantial to achieve the principle, I would say. And then here, you could actually argue this is kind of somewhere in between, where the red does actually kind of come at you a little bit more, just because it seems like it almost has like a little bit more tint of light than that blue. But I would say this kind of contrast compared to this contrast is very low. So let's actually look at those. Look at everything kind of as a whole. If you actually look at it, this bottom right, and let me take these out. Let me take these out. So if you look at it, this bottom right actually has very low contrast compared to these two options here and these two options below. So yes, it has more contrast perhaps than this example here at the right hand side, but ultimately it's not sufficient, in my opinion, to be able to make the information as easy to understand visually as possible. Okay, so when you guys are you're designing buttons, or you're putting text content, or you're deciding the colorway for your website, really keep into mind contrast. The more contrast, the better. And like with any of these principles, you can find the other side to it, where maybe sometimes having something that's low contrast can look cool, but I would recommend staying away from low contrast color combinations or shades when it comes down to the key visual information, which is text content mainly, or stuff like buttons. For more artistic blends of colorways and stuff like that, low contrast stuff can maybe even be what you want. But for information that should be consumed, whether that is whatever kind of graphic that is, it's really important to make it as easy for the user to digest it. And that's why high contrast color combinations and shade combinations end up being what you want. And that's the principle to learn here. To see contrast at play, I recommend going to dribble.com. That's with 3 B's. And take a look at the different visual designs, and you'll notice high contrast and low contrast everywhere. So for example, you see here the red with the white, that's contrast. What was I gonna say? The white with the black, that's contrast right there. Even here, this is more low contrast, the Griffin logo, but still some degree of contrast because you see the star here. And I think the designer was very conscious that he wanted the logo to be seen. So he combined this darker, almost teal color with this lighter teal color. So there's the contrast there. And these examples are all over. I would argue this is actually kind of a low contrast, but again, if you're going for it, like go for it, right? But I would not bank a whole app just on this specific color scheme. You would have to add something lighter in order to really make the information easily viewable. Here's really simple high contrast, the white and the black. Like here, this logo too, you have the white and the black, almost like a grayish white. High contrast here, this is like a olive drab green, maybe like a bluish green, and that white, that high contrast. Here's a little bit low contrast here. Really, really, really interesting. But yeah, just kind of, if you're going for a certain aesthetic, low contrast can definitely be a tool that you can use. But for the most part, you want to make your information easy to consume. So you want to go for high contrast matches. And a way to evaluate that is, how easy is it to understand what I'm looking at? If it's very easy, then it's good. And the contrast is good. If it's very hard, then the contrast is not that great. Here you see contrast, the orange and the white. Probably if you can take a guess out of these three, which one would be the one with the highest contrast? Okay, I would say it's this black one right here, the just black and white, very traditional but very, very good contrast. All right, so we are going to, in this video, deconstruct designs that are out there in the wild. If you want to find some of these designs, go to dribble.com or take screenshots of your favorite website or mobile app, and you could do the same exercise that we're doing here. Now, the reason why deconstruction is important and analyzing references is important is because you get ideas of what you can do with design. And once you've introduced an idea into your brain about what you can do with this design and how it is that was achieved, that visual look was achieved in the design, then you are almost halfway there because you now have an idea of what you can do, as I said, and therefore now it's just a game of reverse engineering that thing, right? So what I'm saying is that if you can break down something into its core elements, then you can utilize those same core elements to construct something that is similar or something that is unique, right? So references and deconstruction is essentially how you advance in design. Aside from implementing and going out and making the designs, if you take in references, if you deconstruct, and you do this for enough time across your career as a designer, and then you implement what you learn, you will get better. Okay, so this is just putting all the principles that we learned today in one little bow tie. All right, so let's first take a look at symmetry, and we'll take a look at this first example. So if you look at this rectangle right here, I think here is a good example of symmetry and asymmetry. So for example, there is a visual object right here at the center, which is this puppy right here. This almost meter-like visual. There is a different distribution of the visual here with the yellow and the red. But if you were actually just to draw this as one continuous round line, you'd notice that it's actually equally distributed between the left and the right. And these elements here at the bottom too, these little indicators, so you'll notice that these elements too two are distributed from left to right pretty evenly. So you have this middle element here that cuts right through the middle. And then you have two elements to the left hand, one element to the left and one element to the right. They are different shapes and sizes, and that's fine because that you're also balancing that. It's that balancing act between symmetry and asymmetry. But for the most part, everything is center aligned here, or aligned based on the center. And you can tell here also these indicators. You have the indicator here in the middle, the red. And if you put a line right down the middle, you have one indicator on the left and you have one indicator on the right. But then you have some asymmetrical aspects to this design too. For example, you have this text element here that even actually breaks into the other quadrant here on the right hand side, and you have this tab looking thing here on the right hand side that's not on the left. So you start to see kind of those asymmetry and symmetry play on each other. And if you were to draw the horizontal line, I think you actually see things be completely asymmetrical from the top to the bottom. So my guess is when he was designing this, he was more so thinking about how it looked like from left to right rather than top to bottom, because if you look at this, you actually see quite a bit of asymmetry. What's on top essentially doesn't look like what's on the bottom, at least from a visual balance standpoint. But that's okay because he's blending both elements to create the visual, right? And as I said in that video, it's not so much that one is good and one is bad. It's that you ultimately end up using a combination of both to get an achieved look. It's usually when it's too far on the asymmetrical side when things start to look kind of wonky. Here in this particular graph, I would say this is actually pretty symmetrical because if you divide this down the line, you kind of get an equal distribution of elements, right? It doesn't, they don't match exactly, but there is quite a bit of visual balance here. There's something on the left, there's something on the right, but there's also asymmetry again horizontally. If you put this here, you'll notice that obviously because it's a graph, if you draw that line right down the middle, you're going to have differences in what's on this top or these top two quadrants and what's on these bottom two quadrants, right? So again, it's just like a blending of both of those concepts that ends up giving you the aesthetic. Let's look at alignment though. So for example, I see some aspects of alignment here that are super cool. So here, the dates, if you notice, these are all drawn in one line. The shapes, they're all drawn on one line here too, these two shapes. The text elements and like the little visual icons, these are all drawn in one line. Like if you draw them through right here, there's one line there, and then there is another one here for these for the text, for these outer texts, right? So the top header items or the top nav items seem to have an alignment with each other, and these sub items also have an alignment with each other. And then actually these, I think he aligned, yeah, it seems like he somewhat aligned the logout icon with the other icons on this left column. If you see over here too, each one of these rectangles is actually in alignment as well. Let's go ahead and look at spacing. So he drew a pretty much like a masonry style grid. So what that means is that the objects in the grid are of different proportions, but they align with each other in some of the examples I gave you. But not just the alignment, the spacing is what gives it that cohesion. So if you notice here, this white spacing, I mean, they're both of the elements, the foreground and the background elements are white. That's not necessarily my favorite thing. You can do that because of the high contrast in the text, which we'll look at in just a bit. But the key thing here is to just look at the negative space. So all the stuff that doesn't actually have content in it, and looking at what, like, is that, how consistent is that? I would say it's pretty consistent in terms of the spacing there. Spacing here is pretty consistent. Spacing here is pretty consistent. Even within these specific elements, I would say the spacing between here and here, those two pieces of text are consistent here as well, right? So, and then here, there's also like a, I guess you could say like an imaginary spacing called padding in CSS. So spacing here looks pretty consistent. Here looks pretty consistent, as well as here. You probably drew one card and then just changed the visuals in it multiple times. And then contrast. Contrast is a little bit more self-evident, but you could tell here, like the gray with the black, purple and the whites, dark foreground, light background, text with the white. Very simple, very traditional. But I mean, especially for stuff like accessibility, just simple and traditional contrast, high contrast stuff, plain black and white has you go pretty far insofar as design. There are here as well, just more contrast. And here, these contrast items are interesting. I know they're a little blurry. You have this lighter green with this darker green. So not the most high contrast, but definitely still some contrast there. A couple more designs here. If you take a look at this design here, let's analyze the alignment. So here you see this stuff being left aligned too. I almost wonder if they're the same guy designed. It almost looks like the same guy designed them. But either way, so if you put this line, draw it down the side, you see that these two, menu and others, are aligned. These visual elements are aligned as well. If you draw a line over here, you see alignment there, right? Matches down there. Alignment down here between these different like black cards. Let's take a look at symmetry. So symmetry, I would say you see both asymmetry and symmetry here in this graph. Symmetrical insofar as the distribution of the graph. You see those candlesticks both on the left and right hand side. A little bit more asymmetrical if you look at it horizontally from top to bottom, but this is actually okay. I would say this is pretty symmetrical. Maybe the most asymmetrical is the fact that this data here on the vertical axis, you see that there's data here on the right hand side, but no data on the left hand side, or you see these elements here on the left hand side, but very little elements on the right hand side. So definitely both of that asymmetrical and then symmetrical principles at play there. Here, I'll say this rectangle here is pretty symmetrical insofar as like these visual elements. So you have these 4 visual elements equally divided on 2 sides of the y-axis there, the vertical axis. On the vertical side, you see that these will probably cut down the middle of the entire rectangle, as it is maybe slightly off, but they're pretty symmetrical insofar as the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. But then you do see asymmetrical elements. The distribution, for example, of this header for this card is off, but intentfully so, and I think it looks fine. So you see the text and the Bitcoin icon here on the left hand side, and you see the button. So not everything has to be symmetrical in order for it to look good. It's actually a balancing of both of those elements and knowing when it should be symmetrical and when it shouldn't. That gives you the effect that you're looking for. Insofar as contrast, this is actually just a reversed version of the black and white text that you see here on the left-hand side. And now you have the text being white and then the background being black. But then again, you see this deep contrast. I would say this green and this red actually contrast really well with the background. These colors here, these brighter colors contrast really well with the black. And yeah, and then insofar as spacing, let's take a look at spacing. Spacing looks pretty consistent throughout. Vertically, I would say these vertically spaced are different than them horizontally spaced between each of the cards. So there's definitely some flexibility there, but generally there is a consistency here between the different grouped items. I would say the spacing is good there too. Let's see, spacing here between these 2 cards looks good. Between these 2 cards also looks good. Yeah, so there's a lot of visual consistency there. And then we will look at this final example. Let's take a look at the symmetry first. So in a way, I actually think this one kind of needs maybe a little bit more symmetry. And if you actually were to draw a line right here down the middle of this content, say this like big red line, I think they started something, but it looks a little too asymmetrical. There's not enough symmetry to balance the asymmetry. And why I say that is because if you see here on the left-hand side, there's some content, but there's way more content here on the right. So the page looks very heavily skewed to the right. So that's a lot of asymmetry off the bat, which makes it kind of seem like there should be something here on the left-hand side that the designer didn't put. And sometimes designers can be very intentional about leaving white space. And maybe that was the case. He was trying to create a certain effect. But I would say from a principle standpoint, to create more balance in this aesthetic is that you want to put some amount of content here. It doesn't necessarily need to be exactly the amount that you put here, but you can increase that balance. Even if you keep it asymmetrical, you can increase the balance a little bit so it's not so jarring, because it almost looks not complete in a sense. Here, I would actually say this is generally pretty symmetrical insofar as there could be probably a additional square here that would really balance things out. But the spacing actually, what was I going to say, mock-up, but you could tell the spacing is actually kind of inconsistent. So you see the spacing here is a little bit wide. spacing here is a little bit narrow, and that matters a lot when the elements are grouped together, because when they're grouped together, you want them to, that spacing to really to match up. So there is some inconsistencies there, but overall it looks like this guy is learning, and he's on his way there. It just still needs a little bit of work here. This is there's not really a reason for this to be this asymmetrical on for example. Okay, so here I would say this image too is just a little too asymmetric. So the key thing with asymmetry and symmetry is that you want them to kind of play off of each other. And if you lean especially too hard on the asymmetrical side, it just kind of off, right? Visually. So it's always a blend of both. If they're too symmetrical, then things look too strict and kind of, it doesn't have like an artsy flair to it, right? So there is really a balance. But here, if you're landing on this page and the first thing you see is just the top half of this, and you have to scroll down to engage with the page, I would have to look at the frame, but generally you want to, I would put that content up here and then maybe balance that out with like a CTA down here. So just retain more balance in my symmetry. Right here, this image feels very weighted to the bottom half, which is fine, but you have to have some more symmetrical elements to be able to balance that out. Insofar as alignment, I think he does pretty good in so far as alignment. You could see here, all these elements here are left aligned, right? So you see there, if you were to look up here, I think all these elements here are center aligned. So you see this, yeah, so pretty much everything there is center aligned. So that's cool, and that kind of creates a top to bottom symmetry there. The spacing I noted is just a little bit inconsistent, but the contrast seems to be pretty good. So if you look here, he uses a black to white contrast here. Black to white contrast here, which is pretty good. Black to white, maybe like a darker gray, has big imagery there. I think I kind of see the example he was going to using, where he has this these big rectangles essentially being the different sections of the site. So I think that's kind of a cool idea, and you do see some symmetry here with this image, obviously, especially this vertical symmetry, and maybe not so much on the horizontal axis. But the spacing here is pretty consistent, I would say, on these ones. I'm not a big fan of spacing things so closely, but I do think he did a pretty good job at keeping things consistently. I'll just look at some lines down here. So yep, I would say this is pretty good aligned, left aligned, and then you have an alignment between these pieces of text here. Looks like you have alignment between the top of that text there and that email. Yeah, and it looks like these pieces of text are aligned good. There's another line here. There's another line here. These two, this button and this text is aligned there. So after doing this with quite a bit of experience, I've now kind of deconstruct these different references in my mind. I don't really have to think about them so much as explicitly as I explained them today. But after you practice this long enough, you will start to see these emerging principles, these emerging patterns in every design, and you'll notice it actually in the real world too, when things are visually off. And that's really how you get better, right? As you look at different things, those references, you look at their alignment, their spacing, their symmetry, their asymmetry, their contrast, and you break them down. And when you go to design, now you know what a design, what those core elements, those core principles are that make up a good design. And implementing them is just a matter of practice. But in order to give the fuel so that you can implement stuff, look at references, deconstruct them visually, and when you go to use Figma, you will have some idea of what it is that you can actually do with that specific tool. Okay, so I hope that was really good for you and you learned something extremely valuable. With those principles, you will be able to go to pretty much any tool where you could do UI, UX design and go ahead and implement them. And that's what I recommend doing, is starting from those principles and then just learning the tools as you go. Those tools are there to assist you on actually being able to implement these said principles. So once you know them, the tools just take a little bit of time to pick up on. But if you want to look at each of the lessons that I taught visually, I will leave a link for the Figma in the description box down below. Just sign up with your email and you'll be able to access it for completely free. So thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions or you need help with anything, just make sure to leave your questions in the comment section for this specific video, and I would be happy to help. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.